Hi, so welcome to this ADSA SIG meeting, which is kind of a combination SIG meeting with the education SIG and the diversity, equity, and inclusion SIG, and also sort of maybe the ethics SIG. Depends on how you want to spin this. I'm Steve Van Tuylen, the community manager with Academic Data Science Alliance, and we're here with Dr. Sandra Peterson to talk about re-examining the use of the GRE. And I will hand over responsibility for the screen to Dr. Peterson, and we'll get things started. Please hold your questions until the end. Although, Dr. Peterson, do you have a preference, or can people interrupt, or would you prefer questions at the end?
I often get a lot of questions, so if we're going to worry about time, I'll take them at the end.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And you can either, when we do questions, unmute yourself because we're not a huge group, and just ask your question, or you can put your questions in the chat and we'll address them there. Okay, so over to you.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here. I thank everyone for their interest in this important topic. I basically got into this because I've been running NIH and NSF diversity programs for approximately 20 years. And that's another very long story. Someone who looks like me and comes from a town of 500 people in the northeast corner of Nebraska, where diversity was Lutheran, Catholic, and Presbyterian. And yes, they could discriminate against each other. There was no interreligious dating allowed. So after coming into this field, I've figured out really fast that one of the main obstacles to really diversifying the STEM doctoral programs was the GRE scores. So we did a lot of things to work around them. We had internship programs, lots of things to make the faculty ignore the GREs. But we decided that maybe that wasn't enough. So why do we care about whether GRE scores predict STEM PhD completion? Because that's what I'm going to talk about mostly today. Well, using the current strategies to choose students results in a national completion rate of approximately 40% of students graduating in 6 years, and only 60% then graduating even after 10 years. So we're choosing students, but we're not getting a really high rate of return. The other thing is that women and students from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups score lower than other groups on the GREs. So it's less likely that they're going to be admitted to programs that give weight to the scores. And then finally, funded STEM students leaving these programs cost billions of dollars nationally for each entering cohort. Often that fact gets more attention in these presentations than other things. So this is a slide from work by Casey Miller and Kayvon Stassen in 2014, where they show the consequences if you use GRE cutoff scores. And although the ETS says you shouldn't, many programs do, especially programs that have large number of applicants. The first criterion is getting rid of people who don't have GREs above a certain rank. In fact, when we tried to analyze our data for math students, there were so few students under 700 that we couldn't analyze the data in any meaningful way. So if you look at the various racial and ethnic groups, and if we especially look at our students from underrepresented groups, you'll see that most of them in either physical sciences, engineering, and also in life sciences are falling below this critical line that's often used by programs in the physical and engineering sciences and also math. So we're really leaving out a pretty large segment of our population. So in fact, the US population is, this is shown here, that you can see that's majority white, but then compared with the STEM PhD programs, it's quite disproportionately white. So women also earn only 25% of STEM PhDs, and those from underrepresented groups earn only 7%, despite their significantly higher presence or percentage in the population. This is going to be a continuing problem because by 2050, it's projected there won't be a majority, so that groups that are now in the minority will be at a much higher representation. So we need to be training people from all races, ethnicities, and genders. So this is just a kind of a tongue-in-cheek but possibly important slide. But this is on the cost of attrition from STEM PhD programs in a study we did, and our study included 1,805 students. So the average cost of training each STEM student in our sample was $58,000 a year. 102 students left after the first year, so that's a loss of $5,900,000. 601 students left after 3 years. Now, often they do leave with a master's degree, but if you remember that master's degrees in many institutions are now a moneymaker because students aren't paid, they actually have to pay. So that's another fairly large loss. So the total cost of attrition of just this one cohort was $110 million. So I don't know how many of you know about the history of the GRE. I didn't realize why or how this came to be, but it came into use after World War II. So it's been around now for over 75 years. The goal was to provide an objective test to evaluate credentials of applicants from different and often not widely known undergraduate programs. But remember, this group was largely a group of men coming back from the war, largely white men. And so they were more homogeneous than we have today in our population. So the tests were devised to make sure that no matter where they went to colleges, they could somehow be compared objectively. The test was revamped in 2011. And these are the latest data that I had. About 584,677 students took the test at a cost of $205 each. And although there are reduced fees and financial aid available, it's still very expensive, especially because students are expected often to take the test more than once, and then they have to pay to send it to individual institutions. So what is the revised GRE? I hadn't taken GRE for many, many years, and I suspect you all might also be surprised. So the test is adapted by section. That means how you perform on that first section determines the difficulty of the second set of questions you get. Okay, so the other thing is that the scoring scale changed from 200 to 800, from 200 to 800, that was the range, to the current range of 130 to 170, and 130 is the score if no questions are answered. So it's a very compressed scale. The test lasts for 3 hours and 45 minutes. Students get 1 minute breaks after each section, and then a 10-minute break after the third section. And women and underrepresented minorities continue to score lower than men on GREs. And we'll talk about this later, but if you can imagine, one of these things is that this is a high stakes test. And if people go in knowing that they're from a group that doesn't do well, you can imagine that they might have a bit of test anxiety at the beginning of the test, which is really important because that's going to determine your ultimate score based on the questions you get in the next section. So basically, what do the tests test? Well, the GRE quantitative tests doing high school math knowledge, or rather doing it really fast. And the GRE verbal tests the knowledge of words that can be learned from a set of flashcards. I don't usually like long quotes, but this one is from a student that I'm very close to, Destiny Knox. She's a PhD student who came from Carolina A&C, and she's now at Carnegie Mellon in engineering. And so what she wrote about, when I asked students to write about their experiences about GREs, she said, I saved the money to buy a book and learned flashcards for 180 of the most common GRE words, and eventually took the test for a second time, boosting my score from the 40th to the 70th percentile. This huge score increase indicated that knowing a series of big words is the equivalent of being proficient in English. When she got her data the first time, that she got a 40th percentile, and they said that she must be English must be your second language. She said, you will be sad to know that I have subsequently forgotten all the words I studied except for enigma and stigma. So I'm pretty sure English is once again my second language. So that's a life, or yeah, a real life example of how these things work. This shows that all of the groups from underrepresented groups and white women still score less well on this revised test than white men, Asian, and Asian white women and men both. And again, this is a really compressed score. If you get around the 145, you're in the 25th to 30th percentile. If you get 150th, you're around the 60th percentile. So the question we wanted to know, because these things were such a problem for us, those of us who had NIH and NSF grants trying to diversify STEM doctoral programs, we wanted to know if GREs predict indices of success that are sufficiently important to justify their continued use. And then we'd find a way to train people to take them. So the evidence I'm going to show you first is the evidence that's most often cited to support the use of GRE scores. And there are two main groups that have done these. These are the Cancel studies of 2001 and 2007. They use the same data. It's a meta-analysis of 1,753 studies conducted over 50 years from the late 1940s to the late 1990s. And even that should give you pause, I would think. They then adjusted data to make the studies more comparable. And although these were two separate studies, they used the same data, but the second used a different correction that increased the significance of the findings. The other thing that is important is that they combined data from master's and PhD students, and based on our work, this might be an issue, that they combined data from men and women. So on the left, I've graphed the percent variability that are explained by the GRE. So the graduate grade point average, verbal and quantitative, is somewhere around 6 to 8%. First year graduate GPA also is low, faculty ratings low. And if you can't really see this, but they actually showed a negative correlation like we did, where the GRE quantitative score was actually negatively related to the degree completion. These are the life sciences. In the physical sciences, the mathematics and physical sciences, you saw basically the same thing, although there was some evidence that faculty rated students with higher GRE quantitative scores as better students, quote unquote. This kind of seems like a circular argument, because if you know that your student's GREs, then you sort of view them through the lens of, this is a really good student. So the other study then was done by Burton and Wang, also from the ETS. And this study was done because the previous study used a meta-analysis, and they recognized that the meta-analysis requires data manipulations, and also outcomes can depend on what studies you include. So the other studies did not pay attention to discipline or the type of institutions included. And what they said at the end of in their paper is that a measure that predicts first year grades but is unrelated to later success would not be a desirable admission measure. And that is indeed what they found, but they had, yes, I'm getting ahead of myself. So they had 1,700 students from 21 departments in 7 institutions. They were entering master's or doctoral programs in these years, and they had separate analyses for groups of disciplines. So for the non-STEM, again, when they looked at the percent of students who withdrew, who had not yet attained candidacy, and those who had attained candidacy or degree, there were no differences among these groups in either the GRE verbal or the quantitative. The same is true in the biological and chemistry and psychological studies. So they found no data to show that there was an effect, and yet they argued that it's possibly that their study didn't go long enough because these students hadn't only been in the program for 3 to 5 years. So that was their interpretation, that their data didn't have the power to show that. A group of us for years we'd go to our NIH PI meetings, NIH and NSF, and these grants were focused on diversity, and they wanted students to be part of training grants. Well, training grants at that time required GRE scores. And so we went to the NIH and NSF and said, you need to drop the GRE scores from reports on the training grants because it's interfering with us getting students accepted into the STEM GRE programs and even our STEM PhD programs, even though we know that most of us had enough experience now that we knew that the GREs were not doing anything that was predictive. So one of the first studies was a study of 57 students at Ponce. And what they showed is that neither the undergrad GPA nor the GRE scores predicted PhD completion or time to degree. Then at Vanderbilt, they've done several studies, but the study of 683 students, they found no correlation between GRE scores and graduation, passing the qualifying exams, time to their defense, presentation count, first author publication count, ability to secure independent grants and fellowships. There was a weak quantitative and verbal score correlation with the first semester GPAs and the graduate GPA. They also said that the higher GRE verbal scores predicted somewhat better faculty evaluations, but we understand the problems with subjective evaluations. Then Josh Hall at UNC did a study of 280 doctoral students, but they were in the biological and biomedical science program at UNC Chapel Hill. And they found that neither undergrad GPA nor GRE predicted either productivity in terms of publications or time to degree. And also in their supplement, they showed that there was no difference in graduation rates. But these were fairly small studies. So that what a group of us, for 15 years, I've led the Northeast Alliance for Graduate Education and the Professoriate. It's a group of 15 institutions focused on increasing diversity in STEM. So what we did is we did a study of 1,805 STEM doctoral students that were in 4 state flagship institutions of various sizes: Rutgers, University of Vermont, University of New Hampshire, and UMass. So we had a wide range of institution populations. The STEM disciplines you can see here: biology, biological sciences, physical sciences, computer and information sciences, engineering, geosciences, math sciences, and some technology programs. Our sample was 72.4% white, 11.4% Asian American, 6.9 underrepresented groups. So we were never able to disaggregate the groups and just run underrepresented groups. We're working on that. Other, 9.3%, and then women, 42.5%, men, 57.5%. And these basically are correlated with GRE scores. So the methods, and I'll give a disclaimer. I was always telling Steve that I'm not a mathematician. I don't do data science, but Krista Giles was our wonder kid here. So she did a logistic regression approach, and she modeled the degree completion as a function of institution, gender, and then either GRE verbal or GRE quantitative scores. Then when there was an interaction found to be insignificant in explaining the variability, we didn't include that in subsequent models. So we found no institutional effect in our regression model, but there was a gender effect. So in subsequent analysis, we combined data across institutions, but analyzed genders separately using two-way ANOVA with gender and completion rates as the main effects. And the completion rates were compared using chi-squares. So the first thing we saw was that GRE scores are consistently higher for men in the sample. The men score higher on the GRE. So that again is sort of that fits with these being related to their admissions based on GREs. So there was no difference in verbal scores, but women in each of our institutions, A, B, C, or D, all men always scored higher. But there were no gender differences in STEM PhD completion rates. The overall completion rate for women was about 58.6%, 62.8% for men. There was no difference in the time to degree, nor was there a difference in the mean time to leaving the program. If you're going to leave, they most left at about year 3. So the interesting thing came out when we looked at, we disaggregated our data based on gender. And what we found is that GRE scores did not predict completion for women, but they were negative predictors for men. That's probably overstating it, but the GRE verbal for women who completed the program versus those who did not complete didn't differ, nor did the quantitative score, the average quantitative score, differ between those who completed and those who did not. And these are fairly large N's, as you can see. For the men who completed the degree versus those who did not complete, we found something really interesting. The mean for the GRE verbal score was higher for the men who did not complete than for those who completed. And that difference was also seen in the GRE quantitative to an even greater extent. So that was really surprising. I kind of suspected there would be no relationship, but this one I didn't see coming. The other thing we checked is the EGS has said that the GREs, this doesn't make sense to me, but they said that GREs weren't meant to predict PhD completion. They were meant to predict readiness for doctoral work. Well, we reasoned that, okay, that means that they're ready to do courses, and they do most of the courses in the first year in most programs. So then if that were true, then we should see a difference in leaving after the first year based on their GRE scores. And we did not. Either the GRE verbal or the GRE quantitative were the same for those who completed and those who left. And for men, the same. There was no difference, no significant difference. So the next thing we decided to do is rank order the GRE scores, divide them into quartiles, and then do a more detailed analysis to try and figure out what was going on. So again, let me just go through this. The women, the mean GRE quantitatives, this is the high, the Q1 is the high score, and Q4 is the low. And this is the mean percentile of those scores. So this group had a mean percentile of 86. This group had a mean percentile of 27. So the other thing that the ETS argues is that the data are truncated because we're only taking students with high GREs, and in these institutions, that was not the case. So there was no difference. Let's see. Getting ahead of myself here. So the completion rate across these groups for women, again, did not differ significantly. But for men in the highest quartile finished at 56.2% of the time, and those in the lowest, and I mean lowest, that's the mean percentile is 34, finished at 74%. So we thought, so these are the data presented in another way. These are the quantitative, the men in the lowest group complete at a higher rate than those in the highest quartile. So then we thought, well, maybe there's something about one of these institutions that's throwing it all off. So we then looked at each institution separately, and this was really stunning. So we saw that, again, this pattern of those in the highest quartile finishing at a lower percentage than those in the lowest quartile. And it was across institution A, B, C, and D. This wasn't significant. These are on the two smaller institutions, but the pattern seems to be the same. So there's something strange going on, or something unpredicted going on. Well, we thought, okay, maybe we were looking at quantitative data. Maybe the men that had the low GRE Q score, or the quantitative scores, were accepted because they had exceptionally high verbal scores. And that might be reflected in their abilities to complete PhDs. Nope. Men with the scores in the lowest GRE quartile, quantitative quartile, generally had lower GRE verbal scores. So the scores of the GRE verbal scores were lowest in those that had the lowest GRE quantitative scores. And again, it was the same in all institutions. Well, okay, so then we thought, well, maybe it doesn't matter in life sciences, and we pooled all of these students. So what about engineering? Surely these things have something to do with success in engineering. But neither GRE scores nor PhD completion rates differed between men and women in engineering. And if you look at the average score, the quantitative score for men and women, and particularly women, these scores are much higher for women than those that are that were accepted into the life sciences program. So you're cutting off, you're probably cutting off a lot of, or you're missing a lot of women into the programs because of that cutoff. The completion rate for men and women was also not different. So then we looked at women who completed engineering degrees and those who left. The verbal scores did not differ significantly, nor did the quantitative scores. Men who completed the degrees had no difference in their verbal scores, but those who left had significantly higher GRE quantitative scores than those who completed the degree. So just to summarize this part, the GRE scores did not predict time to degree or who would leave the first year, and that argues against the fact, or argues against the theory that GRE scores predict how well students will do in the first year, whether they'll pass the courses or not. And I think if we're all honest about this, I mean, graduate students usually get a C or above in the courses, so it's pretty compressed already. GRE scores, and to a lesser degree GRE verbal scores, were lower for men who completed their doctoral programs than for those who left. Males who leave engineering PhD programs had significantly higher GRE quantitative scores than those who completed the degrees. So then we get to this more, this is more your diversity and inclusion part of the talk, I suppose. So we've thought about this, and those of us who have been working in this field for 20 years, the question was, why do women and students from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups do less well on standardized tests? And we've talked about this a lot with our students and also among our faculty groups. So there are sources of unintentional bias in the GRE. For one thing, those who have anxiety about high stakes tests, as I said previously, may underperform at the beginning of the test so that their scores are lower because of that section adaptive format that's used. So if you're going there really stressed, then you're going to get shunted to the lower expectation GRE test for the second part. Those in lower socioeconomic groups cannot afford expensive but effective test preparation courses. Some do not have the recommended 1 to 6 months to study for the exams because of other responsibilities. Many of our students are working. So a lot of people, or when I give these in at various institutions, people will say, well, we don't really pay attention to GRE scores in the admission process, so what's the harm anyway? So I'd say that there's collateral damage of requesting the GRE scores. Students with test anxiety may rule out graduate school before even taking the tests, and we've seen that. Test scores may determine the programs to which the students apply. That way, they're limiting their options. Students with lower than average test scores define themselves by their numbers. And I've seen this over and over again. And it's very, very frustrating. I'll do an aside here. One of our first students that we brought in for an internship program was brought in because she'd done really well in the summer. Her PI wanted to keep her and admit her to grad school. Her PI was on the admissions committee. She saw that her scores were in the 23rd percentile and said, we can't accept her. So I said, well, we'll put her in an internship program. So that was the beginning of our internship program. She aced all her graduate courses. By year 3, she was voted outstanding graduate student of the year. And right now she's heading up the COVID vaccination program in Puerto Rico. So she's one of our many examples. The other thing that really bugs me is that faculty expectations may change if they know the GRE scores. So I never look at the GRE scores when I accept a student, because I do think there's something that is in the back of your mind that you think, well, their scores weren't very high. The other thing, of course, is the diversity is limited. So other reasons to reconsider the STEM doctoral students admission strategies. For one thing, STEM doctoral training is changing. This whole didactic, memorizing all of the stuff in the classroom and doing individual projects is being replaced by problem-based team learning and interdisciplinary research. And GRE scores don't measure how you're going to perform in those environments. They don't predict your creativity. They don't predict how your life experiences add richness and diversity of thought to these projects. The other thing is that GRE scores are no longer used to assess program or individual quality. Thank goodness, GRE scores are no longer reported for NIH training grants or individual fellowships. GRE scores are not part of the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship Program application, and they don't impact US News and World Report's ranking in science, computer sciences, or mathematics. So here are some of the advantages of not requesting GRE scores. We found that our applications increased by an average of 40%, and diversity increased substantially, up to, in some programs, up to 50% more students. The motivation that you get if you're not going to rely on these GRE scores, you have a motivation to decide as a program, what are the characteristics, skills, and knowledge you really want in your students? Do you really want their main characteristic is to have high GRE scores? Isn't there something else perhaps that you'd like to know about them? So I hope that I've convinced you that there's not much evidence that GRE predict anything useful for success in PhD programs, or at least STEM PhD programs. So why do we use these scores to make decisions? Well, one thing is the ETS keeps putting out information that says that the scores are valuable. They say that they provide important information about the candidates, but if you talk to them or ask them questions, they can't really tell you what those important characteristics are. They assert that studies, our studies and others failed to find a relationship between GRE scores and success is because students with low scores are not admitted, so the data are truncated. And we've shown with our study that that's not the case. GRE scores were, this again is from the ETS, they were not designed to predict PhD completion, only readiness for doctoral programs. I think we've debunked that one. This one is, I find a bit cynical, but I'm getting ready to retire, so. Omitting GRE scores may negatively impact diversity initiatives. So you saw the percentage of students of color who make it over this bar. There is already an explicit bias in the GRE scores, and where you're getting rid of a whole lot of untapped talent. So yes, if there are programs that are showing implicit bias based on where the student comes from or something else, then maybe that the program shouldn't be, maybe those students would be better off somewhere else anyway. They also finally argued that holistic admissions procedures that include the GRE constitute the best practice for selecting students. They, out of the other side of their mouth, they say that you shouldn't rely on GREs to select students. And yet in the latest publication I saw in Heckinger report, the CEO said, this is the first year students weren't taking GREs, so now they won't know why they are or are not being accepted to grad programs. I mean, they're essentially acknowledging that this is a big deal, that this is an important criterion, and yet they're saying, oh no, they should just be included as part of the program. And you saw the collateral damage issue. That I think that argues against this so-called holistic admissions process. So some other reasons. There are few exemplars of successful candidates with low scores if you only choose students with high GRE scores. Also, current faculty likely had high GRE scores or they wouldn't be here. So they say, well, we all did well, so they must mean something. The other thing is that when someone with high scores leaves, the faculty accept that and say, well, it just wasn't right for that person, or they had a life of experience that was a problem. But when a low score leaves, the faculty say, oh, it's predictable based on those GRE scores, we should have known. The other thing is this test's been around for nearly 70 years, or it's actually longer than that now. And GRE scores are numbers, so they're viewed as objective measures. As a friend of mine says, height and weight are also measurable variables, and they may have about as much predictive value as the GRE scores. Finally, probably this is the one that really is the real thing. It speeds up the admission process. So if I came to you now, say that you didn't have any admissions process, you're just starting, graduate schools were just starting, and there were no tests. So we have a company that's developed a new standardized test to help you choose your students. We charge $210 to take the test and $40 to have it sent to each school. And it's generally recommended that students take the test twice for the best results. And we sell numerous books that teach students how to take the test so that they can score well. And for $1,200 to $1,600, other companies will work directly with you to significantly improve your scores. And we recommend that you set aside time to study for the exam for approximately 3 to 6 months. And oh, there is a problem that women and students from underrepresented groups do less well on the exam than those from other groups. And the test does not predict STEM PhD completion, time to degree, number of publications, or other markers of success. So if you want your department to be one of those who use the test, please let me know. We'll give you a great deal. Okay, so the other thing I hear a lot is, if not the GRE, then what? Let me just check my time here. Okay. They sort of lack confidence that they can predict or that they can find students without looking at the GREs. I've had off the record talks with people who really feel this. And I point out that in our study, there were hundreds of men who were accepted into this that had GRE scores in the, around the 20th to 30th percentile. And they were selected. So let's find out why they were selected, because they were the ones that completed at almost 80%. So you can choose them by ignoring the GREs, and it's better if you don't have it at all. So that's what I keep telling them, that our data showed that the faculty can identify good students. So I held a conference in about 2017 after we published these, or after we got these data before they were even published. So it was a conference of all of our 15 institutions, our NEGEP institutions, and then I invited people from other institutions. So we had 62 faculty and administrators from 25 institutions and organizations. We met for 1.5 days at UMass. And our goal was to design a better STEM doctoral admissions process, or at least come up with ways of approaching it. So the first thing we had people do is to identify the top characteristics. Think about your most successful students. Who are they? What were they like? So the top characteristics were identified by the faculty. Critical thinking, inquisitiveness, problem-solving ability, clarity of thought was the top. Commitment to something, positive persistence, self-motivation. Adaptability, experience with overcoming failure and adversity, resilience. Relevant research or work experience, written and verbal communication skills, responsible, self-aware, ability to admit when you're wrong, being truthful, independence, self-initiative, self-advocacy, and evidence that they're part of near-peer networks or social, and that they have social and emotional intelligence or a support system. And I think this one, based on some subsequent studies that we've done, having a clear reason for wanting a PhD is critical. The ability to work in a team, organizational and time management skills. So then how do you develop new prospective student assessment tools that do not include that GRE, but they assess these things that we're talking about? So what we had departments do is meet as departments and come up with these qualities that they wanted, that they felt are critical for PhD completion, and that included coursework. So what key courses are deemed important for the success in the program? And then replace the letters of recommendation with a student assessment tool developed using that list of qualities that you identified as important for PhD completion. We've done this in our NIH post-baccalaureate research education program for students who come into our program for a year for research training after they've graduated with a bachelor's degree. And what we do is we have the faculty comment specifically on examples where the students showed these characteristics, and we have the students write their statement addressing those same points. So it's interesting to see how the letters and the students' assessment and the faculty assessment agree. So that's one that's worked really well for us. So additional options. You can develop problem solving or reading response questions relevant to graduate programs and develop a scoring rubric for admissions. This is something a colleague of mine is trying now. You can develop open response questions to assess value qualities identified by the program, like describe an obstacle you overcame. Provide students with research articles or hypotheses and determine in the interview how many interesting questions they pose, that not whether they are at all, it's an interesting exercise, and I think it's actually very telling sometimes. So what I've been asking institutions who are thinking about this no GRE, is we called it the What Next experiment, is based on what was done at the University of Michigan and their umbrella program for biomedical programs. And this is sort of being done this year because you didn't have GRE scores to rank students. But what we've been having programs do is to rank order the applicants using the strategies described without seeing the GRE scores, but using the characteristics that they found appropriate. And then the next thing to do is determine whether the order changes when the admissions committee knows the GRE scores. So at Michigan, they looked at all of their applicants, they rank ordered them, and Scott Barolo, who is running this program, said, we aren't going to show you the GRE scores until you show us your rank order. And then you can, after you've done that, you can ask to see the GREs. And he said not one program asked to see the GREs after they had ranked them. They were that confident. So then if you do that, please send me your results. And I'd like to thank you for your patience. Some of our work is at www.beyondthegre.org. I'm going to show you something that I wasn't planning to, but maybe, because it's makes things a little bit difficult. So what might explain the data showing that men with lower GRE quantitative scores finish at the highest rates? Well, what we did is we looked at the age at admission and GRE completion, or GRE scores and completion rates related to the age of admission. If students were coming in around age 20 to 22, they were finishing 55 to 60% of the times. Whereas those who are coming in later, after probably having, I guess I'm putting this one in for you, Steve, this idea that when we have some real life experiences, the GRE scores go down because you're further away from those basic test taking skills, but the completion rate changes. So I think, oops, I don't need to talk about that one. So I'll go back to saying thank you and let me know if you have any questions. Do you want me to stop sharing, Scott? Or maybe people want to go back.
Yeah, people might want to go back to slides. So yeah, we're seeing some applause emojis. We do have, thank you very much. It's fascinating to see those numbers flying around. And, you know, I think we all hear that there are problems with the GRE, but to see some quantitative evidence of that is nice. Amy, do you want to ask your question, or should Sandra just read it from the chat?
I'm not seeing.
Happy to ask if you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. There's a lot of talk around my campus and other campuses about going GRE optional. What are your thoughts about the optional GRE versus just entirely dropping? And my follow-up question is, optional ever really functionally optional and to students in the admission process?
I'm not sure I got the second part, but let me address the first part. I think GRE optional is a bad decision. First of all, just the toll it takes on students who don't have the resources to deal with all of the taking them. So you're already starting with an uneven playing field. The other thing is, okay, so let's say they're GRE optional. Let's say you have two students. They both look pretty good, about the same. One took the GREs, one didn't. Which do you pick?
Right. And that kind of gets to my second question, because I thought, is it really ever optional? Because it may disadvantage students who either choose not to submit or have some other reason to not submit. And again, then we get to the structural problems with that.
Yeah, from our prep students, we've had in the last 3 years, not one of our prep students has chosen to take the GREs. And I have to tell you a personal story. I had a woman in my lab. She's my lab tech for 5 years. She was absolutely brilliant. She was functioning like a postdoc. She would bring in articles when I'd suggest something. She'd explain to me why I was totally wrong. And she was usually quite right about that. And she was applying to schools. And I said, so have you taken GREs? She says, no, I'm not taking GREs. And she got into many, many programs, and she's doing really well at Brandeis. And our prep students also have gone to good places, Wisconsin. I forget where this batch has gone. One's gone to Duke. So there are places that are taking these students. But again, our prep is all life sciences. So over 200 life science graduate programs have now given it up. And that the list is through Josh Hall, and it's on our website.
Yeah, I mean, that's been our experience as well. And I happen to come from in our graduate programs, we don't require the GRE either and don't take it. But, you know, there is some pressure now to start considering, that GRE optional is why I asked the question. But my experience too is we attract so many students who either don't have access to the GRE or have lack of access to preparation for the GRE. And before we had our PhD program, we would send them off to really great PhD programs because they were very well qualified and not requiring that actually gave them access and in no way put them at a disadvantage in their education.
Yeah, I think going from either not having them and going to optional is kind of backwards from what everybody's doing now. And I think it also puts your program at a competitive disadvantage because you're going to get more applicants if you don't have a GRE requirement.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Thank you.
We are running up against 11 o'clock here on the Pacific, or the top of the hour, wherever you are. And I think maybe I'd like to just follow with one final question for Dr. Peterson. So how can people get involved with Beyond the GRE? Are there going to be future meetings like you held in 2017? What does the sort of movement look like right now?
I think now those of us who started this, so I'm retiring in December, and I've taken up painting. So I'm not exactly sure, but I think what we feel is that we have enough momentum. I mean, the ETS keeps coming out with the same arguments over and over, and it's hard for us to get our rebuttals published. But I think that maybe this year, maybe COVID did something positive in that it's going to give programs an idea that they can. And why are you supporting a $500 million or $500,000 for a CEO, and I forget, $500 million industry, not even all the books and stuff, and the toll it takes on those least able to afford it.
Do you know if anybody is planning to sort of track this cohort of COVID non-GRE students to see?
I don't know. It sounds like a retirement plan.
It would be an interesting project.
Yeah, you don't need data scientists I can work with. No, seriously, I think that would be a great idea. What we're showing is, so the GREs, giving up the GREs at Michigan, I think that's now, it's not quite time for a cohort, but it'll be interesting to see about whether the completion rate changed. The thing I worry about, to be honest, is this idea that there will be, if you don't look at the GREs, there are going to be other surrogate markers, like where did they go to school? So those are the things I think we have to be really careful about. But I don't think it really changes that much in terms of what people are looking for anyway, or what they have been looking at with the GREs.
Excellent. So we're at the top of the hour. Folks are probably going to drop off. We do have, I'm happy to stick around if folks want to ask more questions. And I don't know if our presenter also needs to jump away at the top of the hour, but I'd like to thank you for this discussion. It's really important, and it's great to see some numbers behind this discussion. If folks want to stick around to ask a few more questions or just discuss, I'm happy to do that.
I actually had a follow-up question if we can go just a minute or two over. I was curious about the impact of the COVID year as well. And have you heard, or anyone on the call, has anybody heard of institutions kind of deciding, okay, well, we waived it this year, so maybe we just go forward with the same admissions process and get rid of it entirely for forevermore?
I haven't heard of any programs doing that. Most of our programs, I've given this talk ironically, to many programs at UMass, and out of those, the programs that I have the most trouble with are engineering, cognitive psychology, and math, chemistry, and physics. Actually, no, physics and astronomy are giving it up, but some of the other programs are still nervous. But it'll be interesting to see how they did this year. But certainly, the thing we know is that the application pool gets more diverse, and we also have many more applications. So if we think about the national need, I think that's a good enough reason. So make it a national security issue.
Well, it also just strikes me that all of these programs are, if you're waiving the GRE for this cohort, you have to have established an admissions process. So, you know, if that was the holdup, it seems like you've kind of had to overcome that barrier already.
And surely, I mean, surely they will. The other thing that does happen is that I know one program that was really excited about giving up the GRE as a small program, but what they ended up doing is accepting all the students that they accepted already had master's degrees. I thought, okay, this isn't really what I was hoping for, but yeah, but they've gone beyond that now. They've decided that they can successfully pick students.
I have a couple small. First one, this is really easy. You mentioned the student assessment tool. Is there an example of how that might be implemented for an admission process out there that I could take a look at or review?
I have some stuff on the Beyond the GRE website is way out of date because I have been swamped, but there's a white paper on there about how, designing your own admissions program. But I like the idea.
Oh, go ahead, please.
I like the idea that pointing out that they've already come up with something.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, and I'll just say, you know, as a program historically at my university, at the master's level, we've never, well, as far back as I know, we've never had a GRE, and it's never been a criteria for admissions. But once we got our PhD, which actually happened during COVID, they were kind of forcing it on us. But thankfully, I've functionally waived it since the beginning of the program. But I'm just wanting to put together kind of a practical argument and toolkit for being able to show our admissions committee for the program that this is something we should disregard for future admission processes. I think I'll just make a note, my institution I'm at, we have open admissions for undergraduates. So it seems really inconsistent with with our mission as a whole, as a university. And so I'd like to keep that access as a goal for all of our programs, not just undergrad and masters as well.
Do you have the ability in your office, do you have an Office of Institutional Research or something that you could actually look at your numbers to see if you're seeing the same kind of patterns?
I've been asking for the numbers from across different programs for a while. I think COVID threw everybody for a loop, so I think it kind of got sidelined. I used to be chair of graduate council, and in fact, while I was the chair, I was pushing for this across different programs and asking for the data. Very interestingly, I have one of my graduate students working with SERP, our office, this summer on a related issue. And so I'm hoping that I can just put in another request and get the data.
Yeah, because I don't know if there's something unique about our institutions. I don't think so. And our data are not, and they're just supporting what's in the literature. But yeah. Josh Hall was curious. So he went back and he found the same thing, that males and that, the males with the high GRE scores are the ones that were not finishing. To me, that means that knowing why you want to do a PhD is probably the main thing you want to be assessing. And we've certainly found that in our preps program. If they say, well, I just graduated and I didn't get into grad school, and so I want to do the prep program, it doesn't bode well. But if they know why they're doing it and that it's going to be hard and they have a realistic assessment of it, they do much better.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I really enjoyed listening. Gave me a lot of ideas.
Good luck. I'd love to hear how it goes.
Thank you.
Great. So we're over time. Maybe we can thank our speaker one more time for coming today and showing us this work. It's really great. And I think a lot of us are going to be thinking and talking about this in the coming year or so. So thank you very much for coming. It's been great to have you.
My pleasure. And let me know if I can do anything for any of you who are trying to make a difference.
Excellent. Thank you.